before we get started this morning, just a few announcements I want to make. First of all, as you leave today, there's going to be some students out in the hallway. You saw the Rise Against Hunger video in the announcement section, but we're going to have some students out in the hallway today. We're going to encourage you to sign up. This is a wonderful family-oriented mission opportunity, and so we would love for you to be. We got about 70 spaces, maybe a little less. Rick, do we have less than that? Is that right? So about 70 spaces. After today, we want to have 0. So we're going to lock the doors until everybody signs up. Because I'm telling you, this is going to be great. It's a great thing for us as a church to do, as a community, but it'd be an awesome thing for you to do as a family and as children, to come and pack over 20,000 meals that we will be sending out from this church to make a difference. So there'll be information out in the lobby. You'll see us students out in the lobby. They'll be glad to get you signed up. There's some sign-ups along the windows in the hallway. You can grab one of those as well. But let's try to knock that out today and make that happen today, because this will be a great event that's coming up. And so we started a series last week on relationships, and so we're going to finish up that series today, and then starting next week, we're going to talk about how do we live faithfully in a distracted world. So we're going to take 2 weeks talking about how do we live faithfully in a distracted world. How do our children live faithfully in a distracted world? How do we as adults live faithfully in a distracted world? So we're going to talk about that, and we're going to do it. So you want to be here next week, because we're going to make an announcement next week about what we're going to do the last Sunday in April. It's going to be really cool. It's going to be really different. So you want to be here, but it's going to be an exciting service, and we've got something different we've got planned for that service. So we'll share all that next week. But so that's where we're going. I believe in giving credit where credit is due. So toward the end of my message today, I'm going to be sharing some very practical things about how to have difficult conversation, how to have conversations when we're in the midst of conflict. And some of the practical material that I'll be sharing today comes out of this book. It's called Crucial Conversations. If you've not read this book, this is an excellent book. If you're a business owner, this is a great resource to have. If you're a parent, this is a great resource. If you're just involved in relationships of some kind, this is a wonderful resource, but it's called Crucial Conversations. And if you'll message me, I can get you the more details on it and the authors and so forth. But anyway, this is a great resource. So some of the practical things that I shared toward the end of my message today comes out of this book. And so I encourage you to pick it up and to read it. So just like that, we're going to talk about conflict. How do we deal with conflict? But conflict is kind of like trash. So let me ask you a question, guys. Who takes out the trash in your house? Do you guys take out the trash? Anybody here take out the trash in your house? You take out the trash? Cohen, you're my son. I know better than that. Anybody else take out the trash in their house? Sometimes. How many times, when you're asked like the 5th or 6th time, then I'll take out the trash? Is that the way it works? What about you? Who takes out the trash in your house? You take out the trash? I'm talking about the trash that's in the bin, right? You know what I'm talking about, right? The trash, and how many times does it take your spouse to actually take out the trash? How many times do you have to ask before it's taken out? You don't have to answer that out loud. I already got in trouble this morning when I came in. Pat's already told me that he was in the doghouse all week last week because they had to go home and have some difficult conversations. So you don't have to say that one out loud. But here's the thing, just like trash that's left in our house, trash that's left in our relationships begins to stink as well. And it's not just us that they stink, but everybody around us begins to smell it as well. And so, because here's the thing, I believe that relationships will turn bitter or better based on how we handle conflict. Relationships will turn bitter or better based on how we handle conflict. So how well do you handle conflict? Are you good at it? No. Are you a conflict instigator? Everybody's got one of those in their family, right? It's like that uncle who, you just know he wakes up in the morning, he's like, okay, who am I going to tick off today? Let me just go through my list. I haven't ticked this person off, so maybe I'll send them an email right now. We all have that person, right, in our life who, that's a conflict instigator or a conflict avoider. I'm a conflict avoider. And I recognize that about myself. Early in my ministry, I was really bad about that. And matter of fact, one of the worst decisions I ever made, it wasn't that decision didn't need to be made, but it was the way that I made it. That if I had to go back and do it all over again, I would have done it differently. But I did it the way I did it because I was a conflict avoider, and it caused a lot of damage in myself and in a relationship that didn't necessarily have to turn out that way. So then, and not only to make matters worse, but the person that I was in conflict with actually was a conflict avoider as well. So you had two conflict avoiders trying to have a conflict, and it just wasn't working. And eventually, you know where that's going to go, and that's exactly where it went. And but one of the things that I've learned that as I move along in leadership, that the more I discover that if I want to get anything accomplished, I can't act as though conflict does not exist. If we're going to move any relationship forward, whether it's a marriage or whether it's a friendship or coworkers or in a business, if we're going to move those relationships further, we got to first admit that conflict is going to be a reality. Our success in life is determined by the quality of our relationships, not by how much money we have in the bank, not how successful we are, but based on the quality of our relationships. And the quality of our relationships are going to be shaped by how well you and I can handle conflict. Now, if you say, well, me and my spouse, we never fight, we never have conflict, I'm going to say you're just full of it. That's it. No, you're crazy. Or if you say, me and my friend, we're cool, we never fight, then I would begin to question how deep that friendship really is. And I'm not saying we need to go out and look for conflict. We're not to be that person. But the reality is that if you're in a relationship for any extended amount of time, you're going to be in conflict. Matter of fact, I believe that our relationships can grow deeper when we deal with conflict in a healthier way. Honest conflict actually can be seeds of growth for deeper bonding and meaningful and richer relationships. I mean, even Jesus knew. Jesus knew that we were going to have conflict. So early on, he told us very specifically how we were to deal with it when conflict comes. He says in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 18, he says, if a fellow believer hurts you, go and tell him, work it out between the two of you, and if he listens, you've made a friend. If he won't listen, take one or two others along so that the presence of witnesses will keep things honest, and try again. If he still won't listen, tell the church. Jesus knew that we would have conflict. And I'm gonna go ahead and throw this out. We're gonna come back to it at the end of the message. We're gonna talk a little bit more about it. But here's what Jesus did though. For Jesus, the conflict resolution was not to determine who wins or loses in an argument. For Jesus, the most important thing is the restored relationship. Not who's right or who's wrong, but a restored relationship. That is what was the most important to Jesus. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But I wanted to get that out there. Because he had conflict. I mean, he dealt with it among his closest friends, those disciples. I mean, they were fussing about, hey, I want to be on your right hand. I want to be on your left. I want to be number one. I want to be number two. They had conflict. He had conflict with political leaders. He had conflict with the religious leaders. Conflict followed Jesus everywhere he went. And yet we still call him the Prince of Peace. What made Jesus a peacemaker was not avoiding conflict. What made Jesus a peacemaker was how he dealt with conflict. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Peacemakers are not conflict avoiders. Instead, peacemakers are to be ministers of reconciliation. They are to be people that strive toward reconciliation. The Apostle Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, he says, if anyone is in Christ, he or she is a new creation. The old is gone, the new is here. So as part of being a part of that new creation, as being people who live under the reign of God and live in the kingdom of God, part of our calling is to be ministers of reconciliation, to be ambassadors of reconciliation, to work toward reconciling our world and our relationships to God through Jesus Christ. Paul says, all this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. You see, our commitment as followers of Christ is the reconciliation of the world. So if I had to ask you to name a situation or a circumstance in your life that needs reconciliation, I'm assuming all of us in here could name something. And if it's not personal, it's social. And if it's not social, it's international. We're living in a situation right now that needs reconciliation. We have divided communities. We have families at odds with one another. There are friendships that have been alienated. And yet the beautiful work of reconciliation, and it is very beautiful work, it goes through conflict. And it goes through conflict resolution. Take the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul's entire ministry can be summed up with one word, and that's reconciliation. His whole ministry was shaped by the work of reconciliation. He was a Jew called to preach the gospel to Gentiles. He works toward reconciliation of Jew and Gentile. He struggled with bringing a broken world into the reconciling presence of God. Everywhere he went, he was met by hostility. Everywhere he went, he was faced with opposition. Conflict followed him. He was beaten. He was left in the streets to die. He was ridiculed. He was ran out of town. He debated religious leaders. He argued with politicians. The majority of his letters, of what we have, the majority of the New Testament is made up of Apostle Paul's letters, and the majority of those were written specifically because it was churches in conflict. It was communities of faith that simply could not get along. Communities that he had founded and left to their own, and it over time began to have one issue after another. And he would write back to those churches and try to address whatever it was that they were dealing with. One of such church was the church in Philippi. Now, if you do a really quick skim reading of the letter to the Philippians, you'll find an overall theme of joy. Matter of fact, chapter 1 is really just one long prayer where Paul gives thanks to God and in a very joyful spirit of what he is seeing in the life of the Philippians. He calls them saints, and he commends them for their faith. He commends them for the way they treat one another. He commends them for their faith in God. But the longer you're in a relationship, the longer you're in a community, the greater the risk of conflict. So what do we do? What do we do when that conflict comes? Well, Paul tells us in the letter to the Philippians, and he says this: if there is any encouragement in Christ, if there is any consolation from love, any sharing in the Spirit, any compassion, any sympathy, make my joy complete. Be of the same mind, having the same love, being in full accord, and of one mind. And I want to say, Paul, you have lost your mind. Have you ever been in a situation where everybody agreed 100%? But Paul says, be of one mind. He's just sitting there. He's saying, if following Jesus makes any difference whatsoever in your life, then agree with each other. Some of you are going to have an argument because you don't know where you want to go eat lunch at when you leave here. Agree with one another. Love one another. If Jesus makes any difference in your life, he says agree with one another. Paul, that sounds great. I love it, brother. But I don't know if it's going to happen. How do we do that? How's that going to happen? I mean, somewhere along the way, we're going to disagree. There's going to be a situation where we're going to be at odds with each other. Attitudes are going to get in the way. Opinions are going to get in the way. All of that is going to factor in. So at some point, even in a community that defines itself under the rulership of Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, we're going to disagree. We're not going to all see eye to eye. So Paul, what do we do with that? How do we do that? It reminds me of a story that I heard of a conflict that existed between a pastor and a choir director. The pastor and the choir director did not get along. They did not like each other. They couldn't barely stay in the same room with one another. And both of them were very passive aggressive in the way that they dealt with the conflict. So one Sunday, the preacher got up and he preached a sermon on gossip. And he talked about how we need to hold our tongue, and talked about we don't need to be talking about one another, and we don't need to be gossiping. The choir director stood up after the sermon and he led the whole choir in a song called "I Love to Tell the Story." This went on. He just counters with whatever the sermon. So finally the preacher was just exhausted. He was done. He was tired. So he stood up one Sunday night and he said to the congregation, I've been praying about it. I've been considering it. I'm thinking about resigning. I'm thinking about just turning in my letter of resignation because I think I'm done. I don't think I can do this anymore. And so I just need you to join me in prayer because I think I'm really finished. And so the choir director stands up and he leads the choir in a song and says, "Oh, why not tonight? Oh, why not tonight?" So the next Sunday, the pastor was done. He was finished. He wasn't coming back. He told the congregation, he says, "Listen, I had a long talk with Jesus. And Jesus and I agreed that it was time for me to turn in my resignation. That Jesus told me that I'm done here with this ministry, that it's time for me to move on, and I need to move on." And so the choir director stood up and he led the whole congregation in a song that says, "We have a friend in Jesus." How do we have the same mind when we don't agree? Paul's answer is love. Here's what he says. He goes on in Philippians and he says in verses 3 and 4, "Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility regard others as better than yourselves." Hold on to that. Regard others as better than yourselves. Let each of you not look to your own interest, but to the interest of others. If we're going to work our way through conflict, then it requires love. And it requires the type of love that regards others better than ourselves. It's a love that we see demonstrated in Jesus. And it's a love that forces us in the midst of a conflict to ask the question, is my response, the way that I'm about to respond to this situation, is it motivated by love? That's the question we got to ask. Is it motivated? Is the way that I'm about to react into this situation, is it for the best interest of this other person? Not to let this other person know that I am right and she is wrong, or I am right and he is wrong, but is it motivated out of love? Do I have the interest of the other person in mind? Now, this is what I love about the Bible, and this is where we as preachers sometimes get in trouble. We talk about this stuff like it's theoretical. Oh, that sounds good, but you're not married to my wife. You don't work in that environment that I work in, and it all sounds great. And Paul's got this grand picture of what reconciliation is going to look like, but you're thinking this is not going to work. Well, in the letter to the Philippians, we usually stop in about chapter 3 because chapter 4, you get to all these greetings. And we never read greetings because, well, they're just personal. We don't really know who these people are. And, we feel like, well, that's just, that's not really stuff that we can kind of take with us. But I love what Paul does here. So he set up this big picture, be of the same mind that is in Jesus Christ. Look after one another. And he sets all of this up and he says, oh, by the way, he says in chapter 4, by the way, listen. And so when we think about churches back in first century, that churches didn't meet in buildings like this, of course. They met in homes. And apparently in the church at Philippi met in either one home or two homes or a group of homes. And some of those homes were ran by these two women. And so these two women that Paul names here in Philippians chapter 4, somehow in some kind of disagreement, they weren't seeing eye to eye. And because they weren't seeing eye to eye, it filtered down through the church and to the community, and it started kind of becoming toxic among the community. And so Paul says in that letter, he says in Philippians chapter 4, verse 2, I urge Euodia and I urge Syntyche to be of the same mind of the Lord. The same thing that I just talked about. Here's two people that really need this message. So here's the good news. We didn't invent conflict. The modern church didn't invent conflict. Conflict has been around from the very beginning. Conflict will continue in the life of the church. But what I've learned is how we discuss something is often the real issue, and sometimes even more so than what it is we are discussing. Let me put it this way. Most of the decisions that you and I make in life, they're not necessarily right or wrong decisions. It may be a decision that has two right answers. They're not always black and white in that manner. But what makes them right is what we do with them after the decision is made. It's how we handle the conflict surrounding the decision that sometimes makes it right or wrong. So how do we approach conflict in such a way that it stays motivated in love? And I want to pull some of those practical applications out of the book that I shared with you. And here's just a couple of things, or actually 5 things that I want to share with you. And first of all, we got to start with our own heart. You see, if we approach conflict from a place of anger or resentment or revenge, then it's not going to end the way that it needs to end. Jesus had words about that. He said, why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but don't notice the log in your own eye? Or how can you say to your neighbor, let me take the speck out of your eye while the log is in your own eye, you hypocrite? First, take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your neighbor's eye. Start with yourself. Ask yourself, where is my heart? Am I more focused on restoring relationship or making sure that he or she understands that I'm right and they're wrong? What is your motive? Second thing is make it safe. Listen, I know one thing about me is that I can be a smarty britches. And it really comes out when I'm in conflict. But one thing that does is that it makes a conflict unsafe. Because that's my defense. I don't know what your defense is. Maybe all of us have some kind of defense mechanism that we put up. But one of the things that if we're going to succeed, or we're going to see that conflict finds any type of resolution, we got to ensure that the other person feels safe. The safer someone feels in a conflict, the more willing they are to be vulnerable. The more willing they are to open up. The more fear the more likely they will either do one or two things. They will shut down or they'll run. They'll fight back or they'll shut down. Keep it safe. And keep it safe comes from, remember that the goal of the conversation is the same thing I told you Jesus' goal was when he gave us that rule in Matthew 18. And that it's not to win an argument, but to restore a relationship. That's the goal. Not to determine who's right or wrong, but to restore a relationship. And third thing is don't get hooked by emotions. You know, conflicts are emotional. We can feel hurt, we can feel angry, we can be frustrated, we can feel ashamed. How do we keep from being driven by our emotions? How do we keep from getting lost in our emotions? Well, the authors of this book that I shared with you, they come up with this acronym called STATE. And he says this, STATE. So share the facts, tell your story, ask for the other person's story, talk openly, and encourage testing. And what they mean by that last one is that you need to come up with a mutually agreed upon facts that lead to action steps. So what they said in there, so one of the things you got to do, and this is the fourth thing, is separate fact from story. Everybody has their story when it comes to conflict, because everybody thinks they're right when it comes to conflict, right? That you're right and they're wrong. And so when you're in the midst of a conflict, there's three stories you need to listen for. Always three stories that will show up. One of them is a victim story, that it's not my fault. Or the villain story, it's always somebody else's fault. Or third, the helpless story. Well, it's nobody's fault and we just can't do this and it's not going to happen. The key is to get both parties to agree on a shared story. And that takes a lot of work, and that's where we can honor the people who have gifts of counseling in our midst. We have some wonderful counselors in a part of our faith community and wonderful counselors in our community. And they do the hard work of helping us walk and talk through those stories until we get to a place where we come to an agreed, mutual, shared story. And so if you're in a place right now and you need that, then that's why God has given those folks the gifts that he's given them, to help us all get through the hard work of going to that place where we can have a mutual shared story. Because it's when we get a mutual shared story that we can also begin to put an action plan behind it, and we can begin to move that relationship to a deeper place. And that's the final thing, is that agree on a clear action plan. Because we could all come up with a mutual shared story. You know, Scott and I could be in a disagreement, and we talk it out, we flesh it out, we fight it out, and we come up with a very mutual shared story. And then we were like, all right, dude, that's good, awesome, see you, man. And we didn't do anything with it. But now now that we have this mutual shared story, what are the steps that we're going to take to ensure that we keep moving this relationship deeper and further along? A plan of action. But here's the thing. We're followers of Jesus. And as followers of Jesus, we are aware that conflict comes from within. Matter of fact, James chapter 4 tells us what is the source of conflict among you? What is the source of your disputes? Don't they come from your cravings that are at war in your own life? The conflicts we face are eternal. The work of reconciliation begins with ourselves. It begins by taking a really hard look at my motivations. It begins to, Jesus was very clear when he said, if you're about to place your gift at the altar and you remember that someone is angry, I want you to leave your gift at the altar. You go make peace with that person, and then you come back and you offer that gift back to God. Now, why would Jesus say that? Because our relationships with one another are connected to our relationship with God.